The legend of a Wild West filled with gunslingers and gunfights seems to have left its indelible mark on the American psyche, even though actually such things were rare and very few people in the West ever would have participated in a gunfight. But the possibilities of the frontier, already the stuff of legends, made it possible for Western newspapers to publish outrageous stories which were then dutifully repeated in the East as if they are fact, where people seemed to believe that almost anything could actually happen in this lawless land. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The exact years of the Wild West, or Old West, are poorly defined, partially because the era is somewhat amorphous. The American frontier slowly moved west, beginning as far back as 1607, when colonists first settled at Jamestown. The romanticized period of the Wild West, however, is generally considered to be a shorter period of time, usually beginning in the 1860s. Some historians, like historian Frederick J. Turner, point to the end of the Civil War in 1865. The ending is also unclear, but most historians agree that the Wild West ended somewhere between 1890, when the superintendent of the census said that we would stop recording frontier settlement, to sometime before the U.S. entered World War I, such as the admission in 1912 of Arizona, the last of the lower 48 states. There was, of course, crime and danger in the Wild West, although much of the danger came from the difficulties of surviving on the frontier and comparably less from desperados looking to sow murder and chaos from the ends of their six-shooters. The image of the West as a lawless land filled with honorable sheriffs, countless outlaws, and frequent gunfights began while the West was still wild. Among the chief reasons for this was the proliferation of dime novels that used the West as their primary settings. Among the first successful dime novels was Seth Jones, or The Captives of the Frontier, published as a dime novel in 1861. And although it was set in a frontier western New York, the themes of man versus the frontier would be told over and over in the years that followed. The West, as a romantic and dangerous space, was part of what began drawing tourists across the continent after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. Many of those tourists, however, would be disappointed by what they actually found at the small, hardscrabble towns that dotted the West, which are often built near a mine or other resource and where physical labor was the main profession. That didn't stop many from looking at paintings like those of Frederick Remington or reading dime novels from believing that there was still some truth to that romantic image. It offered fertile ground for hoaxes, falsities, and lies, and many outright false stories were picked up in the newspapers of the East as if they were true. Among the many contributors to the myriad of false stories and hoaxes that came out of the West was none other than Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known to history as Mark Twain. After briefly joining and then deserting a band of Confederate irregulars in 1861, Samuel Clemens, in his mid-20s, was looking for something new. His opportunity came in the form of his older brother, Orion Clemens, who had stumped for Abraham Lincoln during the 1860 election and was rewarded with the position of Secretary to the Government of the Territory of Nevada. Sam accompanied his brother, assisting with the cost of moving across the country. Initially, Samuel worked in mining until he was able to become the city editor of the Virginia City Daily Territorial Enterprise, a newspaper published in Virginia City, Nevada. He wrote on a variety of subjects, and in typical Clemens fashion, often wrote satirically and comically. Among his many articles was one in 1862, which claimed that a petrified man who had lived in the area about a century ago was found south of Gravity Ford. He went on to describe the man as perfectly stony, but missing a left leg, which had evidently been a wooden one during the lifetime of the owner. He said the man was frozen, thumbing his nose and winking. Historian Bruce Michelson concluded that Twain was mocking both the politician and a public that was too happy to accept stories about petrified men, which was a common hoax during the period. The story spread eastwards anyway. In 1863, Clemens wrote another article, meant humorously, that described a bloody massacre near Carson at a place called Empire City. It told the story of a man who lost an immense amount in the Spring Valley Water Company of San Francisco, who then killed and scalped his wife and 6 children. The description was incredibly graphic and specific about the condition of the victims, and the man was said to have rode into town carrying the reeking scalp of his wife before he collapsed dead. Clemens was actually making a political point. San Francisco papers have been publishing articles exposing mining ventures that were cooking their books to encourage investment, and instead told readers to invest in San Francisco utility companies. But the problem was that those utility companies were also cooking their books, and he wrote the sensational piece in order to get those San Francisco papers to publish something negative about the utility companies. Clemens thought he was clear that the piece was a joke, noting years later that the mansion on the edge of a pine forest where the crime occurred was an obvious fiction, as even the very pickled oysters that came on our tables knew that there was no mansion in all of Nevada. Still, the piece was reported as genuine as Clemens had intended, so much so that he had to publish a retraction. Readers canceled their subscriptions, and Clemens even offered to resign, but was refused. As an interesting note, it was while he was writing for the Enterprise that he first used his now famous pen name, Mark Twain, in a February 3, 1863 article. Twain was not the only man whose satirical stories became hoaxes in their own right. He wasn't even the only man in Nevada Territory, or indeed, the only one at the Territorial Enterprise. William Wright, who wrote under the pen name Dan DeQuille, was a friend of Twain's who worked at the Enterprise for more than 30 years. In 1867, he published a curious little article about a new discovery in a valley in Nevada in the Pahranagat Mountains. Some years ago, a prospector who had been roaming through the wildest and most sterile portion of southeastern Nevada brought back with him a great curiosity in the shape of a number of traveling stones. The perfectly round stones were about the size of a whole walnut and very heavy. When scattered on a flat surface within a few feet of one another, the stones quickly began traveling towards a common center and then huddled up in a bunch like a lot of eggs in a nest. If one was put too far, about 4 or 5 feet, it wouldn't return to its compatriots. The prospector said that he found them in a barred valley where the stones, from the size of a pea to about 5 or 6 inches in diameter, gathered in little basins. These curious pebbles appeared to be formed of a lodestone of magnetic iron ore, DeQuille speculated. The article itself is a classic in the often absurd newspaper hoaxes of the time, vaguely scientific, completely without verification, and supposedly seen by the writer himself. The article seemed to go by with little notice, until soon Wright began receiving letters that referred to it, and soon the handful of letters became a deluge. The article had been picked up by foreign newspapers, who seemed all too willing to believe the absurd tale. Wells Drury, another Nevada newspaperman, recalled that when the news hit Germany, it caused a furor among a select set of men who were dabbling in the study of electromagnetic currents. Wright told them that the article was made up, but his denial was treated as an unprofessional attempt to keep his brother scientists in ignorance. P.T. Barnum was even said to have offered DeQuille money if he'd go on tour with the rocks. In 1872, 5 years after he published it, he published another article telling readers that if they wanted some of the rocks, they should refer to our Colorado speculator Mark Twain, who probably still has on hand 15 or 20 bushels. In 1879, he published another article, and this time begging people to stop writing him about the stones. In an idle moment, he began, "This deponent concocted and wrote an item entitled Traveling Stones, and since then the paper has bushels of letters asking about these stones. We are now growing old, and we want peace," he went on. "We desire to throw up the sponge and acknowledge the corn. Therefore we solemnly affirm that we never saw nor heard of any such diabolical cobbles as the traveling stones of Pahranagat." But the suffering that he endured over the traveling rocks did not apparently convince him to stop telling tall tales. In 1874, he penned a story about a new, sensational but tragic invention, solar armor. Under the title Sad Fate of an Inventor, he told the story of Jonathan Newhouse, a man of considerable inventive genius. Newhouse, wrote DeQuille, had invented solar armor, an apparatus meant to protect wearers from the sun. It's made up of sponges worn all over the body, soaked with water. A sack full of water could be carried and squeezed to keep the sponges wet and apparently the wearer cool. Newhouse tested his invention at Death Valley, where he was found frozen to death about 20 miles out in the desert. His beard, the article wrote, was covered with frost, and though the noonday sun poured down its fiercest rays, an icicle over a foot in length hung from his nose. The article was picked up all over the country by the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Times, and even Scientific American. When the story reached across the Atlantic, the London Daily Telegraph expressed some doubt in the story, calling the tale marvelous, but that they should require some additional confirmation before we unhesitatingly accept it. The Telegraph at the time had the largest daily circulation of any paper in the world, and DeQuille couldn't help but respond, claiming the Telegraph gave them the long-awaited opportunity to publish a sequel. The paper had received a letter from a coroner near Death Valley who confirmed the tale and added that the solar armor was moistened with some frigorific mixture. Newhouse's belonging held more than just water, but several bottles and small glass jars of liquids and powders. One marked ether, which the coroner believed was mixed with water to produce the incredible cold. The Telegraph didn't respond to the new article. One of the most famous Nevada hoaxes preyed on the gullibility of Easterners in a different way, taking their expectations of a wild, wild west and giving it to them on a platter. In 1862, the United States Congress passed legislation to build a transcontinental railroad. 3 companies ultimately built parts of the railroad, including the Union Pacific Railroad, which started building westward from Council Bluffs and Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific Railroad Company, which built a railroad beginning in Sacramento, eastward. As the Central Pacific crossed California and Nevada, towns popped up along its length, and one of those Nevada towns was Palisade, or Palisades, built in the Palisade Canyon, which was named after an area of steep cliffs that lined the Hudson River in New Jersey and New York State. Palisade began to grow as a settlement in 1868 and became a prominent station, first as a supply station for mining in eastern Nevada and later as an ore shipping point for mines to the south along the Eureka and Palisade Railroad. By 1878, 31 million pounds of base bullion was shipped by the Eureka and Palisade Railroad. But Palisade itself was never a large town, peaking at around 600 people in the mid-1870s. In 1876, 7 years after the completion of the railroad, a report appeared in the Eureka Daily Sentinel titled Western Deviltry. It described a series of pranks pulled on railroad passengers who stopped at Palisade. The credulity of Western-bound immigrants is passed on into proverb, and when business was dull, 100 pranks were perpetrated at their expense and for their special benefit. This included cooperation with the local Paiute people who, for reasonable compensation, would submit to being bound hand and foot and laid on the platform during the stay of the train, while Palisade locals guarded them with conspicuous weapons. The tales they would tell the tourists would shame the author of a dime novel. If the Paiutes were uninterested, the people of Palisade would fill their guns with powder, ball omitted, and break into a gunfight as passengers stepped out of the train to stretch their legs. Blood came courtesy of the slaughterhouse. Besprinkled on the platform as plentiful as water. The violent spectacle was merely a pastime for the locals, but it left the visitors frightened and bewildered, their blanched faces and trembling limbs attesting their belief in the genuineness of the fight. Considerably later versions of the story added more details. In Lost Legends of the Silver State by Gerald Higgs, published in 1976, Higgs said that the havoc involved a verbal challenge between 2 men, Frank West and Alvin Kittleby. West would shout, "There you are, you low-down polecat! I've been waiting for you, and I'm going to kill you because of what you did to my sister." And then the gunfight began. Dan Ashbaugh, a Nevada newspaperman and historian, described the show as well. As soon as the train pulled into town, shooting commenced in all directions. Victims falling everywhere. Passengers screamed and fled. Ashbaugh even says that they faked Native American attacks when local Shoshone would descend on the town, stabbing and scalping with enthusiastic abandon. On the internet and in various books since, the story has grown to claim that the people of Palisade performed hundreds of times and that papers further east widely reported it as fact. Examinations of period newspapers haven't confirmed that, and the story doesn't seem to be mentioned outside of Nevada. But despite the show of violence, something that many in the East practically expected as a Wild West town, Palisade was said to not even have a sheriff. If Palisade did put on their shows, they would hardly have been the only ones to fake an attack by Native Americans or gunfights for entertainment. Similar gunfights can be seen today at various Western amusement parks like the Boot Hill Museum in Dodge City, Kansas, Tombstone, Arizona, or even Wild West City in Netcong, New Jersey. A man named Silas Seymour described a similar sham fight in 1866 put on by some Pawnees hired by the railroad company to entertain railroad workers. Buffalo Bill Cody describes another fake attack that he arranged in 1871 for a hunting party that he was leading. It's possible that the whole story, in fact, was a hoax, and that the joke is still being played on internet readers 150 years later. Palisade is a ghost town today, and it slowly faded as the mines died. The rail line was officially retired in 1938. Hoaxes and frauds, of course, have been prevalent throughout history, and yet the mysterious Wild West seems to have offered particularly fertile ground for even outlandish stories. There was plenty of room for satire, and clearly the editors and writers in Western newspapers found time to be bored. Communication technology was robust enough to spread a story around the world, and yet occurred slowly enough that some people might have believed some of these stories, even absurd ones, to be true. And of course, people's imaginations were already expanded by the exaggerated tales of the Wild West in dime novels. And the stories that were spread and believed at the time, even if they were purely balderdash, do tell us something about history, and if nothing else, it reminds us to always check our sources. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.